If you could build a wire where electricity refuses to turn around, where disorder scratches, and heat try to trip it, and it simply doesn't fall, would you trust anything else again? It's 2 a.m. In a lab, the oscilloscope is glowing like a small, stubborn moon, and a signal that should be fragile is sitting there, steady. Listen closely. There's a particular kind of tension that only shows up in the middle of the night when you're alone with a measurement. The building is quiet enough that you can hear the ventilation cycle. The cryostat, a metal cylinder that looks like industrial plumbing turned into sculpture, sends a faint vibration through the optical table. Somewhere inside it, electrons are doing what electrons do, moving, scattering, losing coherence, being jostled by the thermal restlessness of matter. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what the world demands. And yet the trace on the screen, our little confession from nature, isn't cooperating with our expectations. It's stubbornly stable. Not perfect. Not supernatural. But stable in a way that feels like a cheat code. Here's the human question hiding beneath the electronics. Why does the world demand fragility? Why does almost every device we depend on, your phone that navigates by satellites, the satellites that navigate by clocks, the hospital machine that watches a heartbeat, why does all of it rely on delicate order that heat, noise, and microscopic imperfections can destroy? Why is reliability so expensive, and why do we have to buy it with manufacturing perfection, cooling, shielding, redundancy, and constant error correction? Now imagine the opposite. Imagine reliability not as a battle you keep losing, but as a property of the material itself. A kind of built-in resilience that doesn't come from polishing every atom into obedience, but from something deeper, something more global. Something like shape. That sounds poetic. It also sounds suspicious. So tonight we audit it. Because there exists a class of materials where the interior, the bulk, acts like an insulator, a dead zone for electrical flow, while the edge conducts like a protected path. Electricity travels along the boundary as if it's been granted a right-of-way through chaos. The claim, when you first hear it, sounds like the kind of story science tells itself right before it discovers it was fooled by a bad contact or a grounding loop. And if you've ever chased a phantom signal for days, you know exactly why your stomach tightens at the thought. But what if it's real? What if the material isn't strong because it's perfect? What if it's strong because it's constrained? What if you could make electronics where reliability is a consequence of geometry, not a prize you win by fighting the universe? So we start where all honest investigations start, with the rulebook we already trust. Most of us learn phases of matter as a childhood list: solid, liquid, gas, ice, water, steam. Different behaviors, same stuff. But physics grows up, and it starts noticing that matter can organize itself in ways that aren't visible to the naked eye. Not just how atoms sit in a lattice, but how electrons move together, collectively, like a crowd that suddenly decides to march in step. That's where quantum phases of matter live. A conductor is not a material that has electrons. Every material has electrons. A conductor is a material where electrons have available states they can move into when you apply an electric field, where motion can happen without needing permission from a forbidden energy gap. An insulator is a material where the electrons are stuck not by glue, but by structure. There's an energy gap, a forbidden band of energies, so an electron trying to respond to the field finds no legal place to go. And a superconductor, that's a whole other kind of collective decision, where electrons pair up and move without resistance, like a perfectly choreographed dance that refuses to degrade into a messy shuffle. But here's the old, brutal rule that makes engineering hard: in ordinary conductors, electrons scatter. They don't glide like tiny bullets through empty space. They are wave-like, yes, but they still get deflected. A vibration in the lattice, what we call a phonon, basically the sound of atoms jiggling, can bump an electron's momentum. An impurity, a missing atom, a dislocation, tiny flaws in the crystal, act like obstacles in a city street. Every collision is a tax. That tax is resistance. And resistance isn't just an inconvenience. Resistance is heat. It is energy you paid for that becomes thermal motion you didn't want. The reason your laptop warms your legs isn't because it hates you. It's because charges are colliding with the world. The reason data centers drink electricity is because information, in our current hardware, is written in a medium that bleeds. So you learn to respect fragility. You learn that perfect conduction is rare and expensive and often requires extreme conditions. You learn to fight disorder with better fabrication. You fight vibrations by cooling. You fight noise with shielding. You fight errors with redundancy. And you quietly accept that the universe isn't on your side. Which is why that 2 a.m. signal feels like a dare. To understand the dare, you need one more piece of the old rulebook, band theory, but told like a story you can hold. Imagine a hotel with floors. Electrons aren't allowed to have any energy they want. The crystal's periodic structure creates allowed floors of energy, bands, and forbidden gaps between them. In an insulator, the lower floors are filled, the next available floor is separated by a gap, and electrons can't easily climb it. So when you apply an electric field, the electrons can't rearrange into a flowing current. They're trapped by the architecture of the hotel. In a conductor, the top occupied band is only partially filled, or it overlaps with another band, so there are vacant rooms right next door in energy. Electrons can slide into them and collectively drift. That's conduction, not electrons escaping, but electrons shifting their occupancy in response to a field. Now keep that picture. Keep the hotel. Keep the idea of a gap. Because the mystery we're auditing hinges on something that sounds paradoxical only if you insist that the whole building has to follow one rule. A topological insulator, those two words, claims something almost rude. The bulk of the material behaves like an insulator. The interior has an energy gap. No easy motion. Dead calm. But the surface, or in a 2D version, the edge, conducts. Not because someone doped the surface like a trick. Not because we painted a wire on top. But because the boundary becomes a different kind of place. I want you to picture it correctly, because the wrong picture kills the wonder. This is not a road painted on the surface. It's more like a coastline. On one side, land. On the other, sea. The coastline isn't an extra feature you added, it's the inevitable seam where two different regions meet. And if the physics of land and sea are fundamentally different, the boundary can be forced to host its own kind of motion, like a tide that must flow along the shore because the world is partitioned that way. But why would nature enforce a tide? Why wouldn't impurities just break it apart like they break everything else? If you're feeling skeptical, good. Skepticism is what keeps you from worshipping your instruments. So we slow down. The lab feels quieter now, not because the pump stopped, but because the question changes. We're no longer asking, "What happens?" We're asking, "Why can't it be otherwise?" That question is where topology enters, not as a buzzword, but as a new way to describe sameness. Topology is the mathematics of deformation without tearing. Imagine you have a lump of clay. You can stretch it, squish it, twist it. Topology pretends you're infinitely patient and infinitely gentle. In that game, a coffee mug and a donut are the same object. One handle. One hole. You can morph one into the other without cutting. What topology cares about are things you cannot change smoothly, features that survive all gentle deformations. The simplest is the hole. The hole is an invariant. It's like a hidden integer stamped into the shape: 0 holes, 1 hole, 2 holes. You can't change that number unless you commit an act of violence: tear the clay, glue it, punch a new hole, close an old one. Now, here's where people usually lose the thread, so let's make it tangible. When we say a material has a topological property, we're not saying its atoms look like donuts. We're saying the electron's quantum states, their wave functions, have a global structure that can be classified in a way that's robust. Not robust like strong metal, but robust like you can't change the number of holes without tearing. A wave function is a kind of instruction field. It tells you, for an electron in a crystal, how its phase and amplitude are distributed. If classical physics is like tracking a marble's position, quantum physics is like tracking a ripple pattern on a pond that never becomes a single point. And crucially, those ripples have phase, like the timing of waves. They can wind. They can twist. They can carry global patterns you can't erase with local nudges. In crystals, electrons don't just have energy. They have momentum, and their states live in a space of possible momenta we call K-space. If that sounds abstract, imagine it as a map of all possible rhythms the electron's wave can take as it fits through the periodic lattice. On that map, the wave function can do something remarkable. It can wrap around in a way that has an integer count, like how many times a rubber band loops around a pole. That integer, sometimes literally an integer, is what we call a topological invariant. Think of it as a hidden census number for the quantum phase. And here's the key: as long as the bulk energy gap stays open, meaning the material remains an insulator in the interior, that invariant cannot change through gentle perturbations. Disorder can roughen the landscape, but it can't change the global count unless the gap closes. So the plot twist is this: the phase of the material isn't only about whether it's solid or liquid, conductor or insulator. It can be about this global invariant. Two insulators can look identical to a basic measurement. Both have a gap, both don't conduct in the bulk, but they can be topologically different in the way their wave functions are stitched together across the whole system. Now we return to that coastline. If you have two regions with different topology, say, the bulk of a topological insulator and the vacuum outside it, then at their boundary, something has to give. The universe cannot smoothly connect two different invariants without a transition zone. And in quantum materials, that transition zone often means the energy gap must close locally at the boundary. A closed gap means available states. Available states mean conduction. This is the moment where the edge states stop sounding like a feature and start sounding like a necessity. It's like stitching together two incompatible fabrics. You can force them to meet, but the seam becomes a special line with its own rules. A zipper has to exist, not because you wanted one, but because without it the fabrics don't reconcile. So in the lab, the edge conduction isn't an accident. It isn't a manufacturing artifact. It's the system doing the only thing it's allowed to do to reconcile a mismatch in global structure. But we still haven't earned the phrase that makes people's eyes widen. Protected. Protected from what? Protected how? Protected by whom? Here's the honest meaning. Protection is not magic. It does not mean infinite conductivity. It does not mean the edge cannot dissipate energy. It means something more specific and more profound. Certain kinds of scattering become extremely hard, sometimes forbidden, because of symmetry and topology working together. Let's make scattering visceral. Imagine you're walking down a narrow hallway. Disorder is furniture scattered everywhere: a chair, a box, a loose cable. In an ordinary conductor, an electron is like a person who can be jostled into turning around at any bump. Backscattering, reversing direction, is common. It kills current. In many topological edge channels, something special happens. The direction of motion becomes tied to another internal property of the electron, its spin, which you can picture as a tiny compass needle embedded in the wave. This spin momentum locking means that if you're moving forward, your spin points one way. If you're moving backward, your spin points the opposite way. Now add a crucial ingredient: time reversal symmetry. It's the rule that, in the absence of magnetic fields or magnetic impurities, the microscopic equations don't prefer forward time over backward time. With that symmetry in place, and with spin momentum locking, many ordinary kinds of disorder can't flip an electron from forward to backward without also flipping its spin in a way that's not allowed by the symmetry of the perturbation. So the electron can scatter, yes, it can deter, it can pick up phase, it can wiggle around obstacles, but the simplest way to kill the current, turning it around, gets suppressed. This is why the signal at 2 a.m. feels like it's refusing to obey entropy. It's not refusing entropy. It's obeying constraints that live deeper than the mess. Now we stress test the model, because a good audit tries to break the claim. Suppose we add disorder. Lots of it. We roughen the edge. We introduce random potentials. We try to make the boundary ugly. What happens? The edge current doesn't vanish the way you'd expect for a delicate surface state. It bends. It finds paths. It becomes a river navigating rocks. The details of where the electrons go may change, but the fact that there is a conducting channel persists. And the reason is subtle. The existence of the edge channel is tied to the topological mismatch, and that mismatch is tied to the bulk gap and the invariant. As long as the bulk stays gapped, you can't get rid of the edge states by gentle means. To truly destroy them, you have to do the one thing topology forbids you from doing quietly. You have to close the bulk gap. You have to drive the system through a real phase transition, like forcing the hotel to collapse floors together until the forbidden region disappears. That's not a scratch. That's not noise. That's not an imperfection. That's a rewiring of the material's quantum identity. And in the lab, you can sometimes watch that happen. Change a parameter, temperature, composition, pressure, and applied electric field. The system approaches a critical point where the insulating gap narrows. The edge signature starts to weaken, not because disorder finally won, but because the very protection mechanism is being dismantled. Then, at the transition, the gap closes, the invariant can change, and the edge states can disappear or transform. If you've ever felt the thrill of watching a theory become inevitable, this is that feeling. The measurement that looked like an error becomes a message. You are seeing a boundary condition of reality. This is the eureka moment, but it's not fireworks. It's quieter than that. It's the sudden relaxation in your chest when you realize you don't have to fight the data anymore. The trace on the oscilloscope isn't mocking you. It's inviting you to understand. The device isn't strong because it's perfect. It's strong because it's constrained. And once you see that, you start seeing the world differently. Because we are used to thinking that physics is local, push here, something moves there, heat this, it expands, add an impurity, resistance rises. Cause, effect, and the tyranny of small defects. Topology says, sometimes the global structure decides what local events are even allowed to do. It's like a story where individual characters can improvise, but the ending is fixed by the genre. No matter how the actors move, certain plot points must occur because the narrative constraints are written into the form. In topological matter, the form is the invariant. Now, before we turn this into a myth, we have to be honest about what this does and doesn't promise. Topological materials are not a universal solvent for engineering problems. They don't erase all dissipation. They don't ignore all kinds of disorder. Some protections depend on symmetries that can be broken, especially by magnetism. Interactions between electrons can complicate the picture. Real samples have finite size, finite temperature, and messy surfaces. Nature never gives you a perfect textbook. But even with that honesty, the implications are still startling. First, low dissipation interconnects. If you can guide charge, or more interestingly, guide spin, along channels that resist backscattering, you can imagine circuits where signals degrade less, where heating drops, where efficiency improves. Not because you used better copper, but because you used a phase of matter that refuses to behave like a conventional metal. Second, robust spin currents and spintronics. In ordinary electronics, we mostly use charge as the information carrier. Spin is like a second alphabet embedded in the electron, and using it can be powerful, but spin is fragile. It relaxes. It decoheres. Topological surface states, with their spin momentum locking, can offer ways to manipulate spin textures more robustly. The dream is devices that do more with less energy by exploiting the quantum structure rather than brute force voltage. Third, metrology. Standards of measurement aren't glamorous until you realize civilization runs on them. There are topological phenomena, like the quantum Hall effect, that give quantized, extraordinarily precise values tied to fundamental constants. Those quantized values are robust in a way that makes engineers and experimentalists breathe easier. Topology can turn a messy material world into a clean number. And then there's the one everyone whispers about because it sounds like science fiction: fault-tolerant quantum computation. Quantum computers, as we currently build them, are like trying to keep a soap bubble intact in a sandstorm. The quantum bit, the qubit, must stay coherent, meaning its delicate phase relationships must survive long enough to compute. But the world is noisy. Every stray photon, every vibration, every microscopic defect is a hand reaching in to collapse the state. Our current strategy is heroic but expensive. We use cooling, isolation, and layers of error correction. We encode information redundantly and constantly check for mistakes. It works, but it's like flying by continuously rebuilding the plane out of spare parts. Topological approaches suggest a different philosophy: make the information physically harder to corrupt in the first place. If you can store quantum information in a global property of a system, something like a topological degree of freedom, then local noise has a harder time accessing it. Not impossible. Harder. This is where you hear about topological superconductors and Majorana-like excitations. Let's treat those words with respect. A Majorana mode, in this context, is not a particle flying through space like a tiny marble. It's an emergent excitation, a pattern in the quantum state of a material, that can behave as if it is its own antiparticle. The reason people care is that pairs of such modes, separated in space, can encode information non-locally. Non-local encoding is like writing a secret across 2 pages in different rooms. Burning one page doesn't erase the message. But, and this matters, this remains active research. There have been claims, debates, reanalyses, and hard lessons about how easily ordinary effects can mimic extraordinary signatures. The audit is ongoing. If someone sells you a consumer Majorana laptop next year, you should be suspicious. Still, even the possibility tells us something profound. We are learning to engineer not just materials, but the rules materials must obey. And that loops us back to the philosophical heart of tonight's mystery. When you first meet physics, it feels like a catalog of forces. Gravity pulls. Electricity attracts. Magnetism twists. You learn to think in pushes and pulls. Later you learn fields, invisible fabrics of influence. Later still, you learn symmetries, deep statements about what cannot change. Topology belongs in that deepest layer. It says, the universe sometimes protects behaviors not with an active shield, but with a structural impossibility. It's the difference between a security guard and a locked door that has no keyhole. In a topological phase, some outcomes aren't merely unlikely, they're disallowed unless you break the conditions that define the phase. And that's why this matters beyond devices. Because it changes how you interpret reliability, fragility, and control. We live in a world where we blame failure on imperfections. The scratch, the defect, the noise, the heat, these are the villains. And often they are. But topology teaches a gentler and stranger lesson. Sometimes you can design systems where imperfections aren't the main story. Sometimes you can move the battle from the local battlefield to the global architecture. Let's go back into the lab one last time. It's 2:13 a.m. Now, the trace is still there. Someone, maybe you, maybe me, has stopped blaming the cables. The measurement is not a bug. It's a window. You look at the cryostat and you realize it's not just a refrigerator. It's a portal into a regime where shape doesn't mean the outline you draw with a pencil. It means the way quantum states wrap, connect, and refuse to be untied. Outside the vacuum can, the air is ordinary. Inside, the electrons are obeying a deeper rulebook. And that rulebook says, if the bulk has one topological identity and the outside has another, the boundary must carry the difference. The edge must conduct. Not because we asked nicely, but because the universe has no gentle path to make it otherwise. So what looked like impossible current becomes a message. Protections can be built into shape. Our job, our responsibility, really, is to learn how to write circuits in that language. Here's the synthesis, plain and sharp. Ordinary conductors fail because electrons scatter. Imperfections turn motion into heat. In topological insulators, the bulk stays gapped, insulating, while the edge hosts conducting states compelled by a mismatch in a global invariant. Those edge channels can be robust against many kinds of disorder, especially against simple backscattering, because symmetry and topology constrain what scattering is allowed. And to remove that robustness, you don't scratch the surface, you force a phase transition by closing the bulk gap. Now for a thought experiment to carry into your own life. Imagine two versions of you. One is defined by local details, every tiny mood swing, every daily disruption, every small mistake. The other is defined by global structure, the values you refuse to abandon, the relationships that anchor you, the long-term patterns that persist even when days get messy. Which version is more protected? Topology doesn't make you invincible. It makes some kinds of failure harder, because the story is written into the structure, not the surface. And that opens the next great question, the one that should keep you up, in a good way. If global structure can protect electrons from disorder, what other parts of reality are governed less by local pushing and pulling, and more by deep, invisible constraints? If you want to stay in this investigation, do three things. First, watch the video on the end screen. I picked it because it continues this exact feeling of the universe revealing a deeper rule. Second, subscribe, not for headlines, but for audits. Each episode we take a seductive scientific claim and stress test it until what's true becomes usable. And third, answer this in the comments with a single sentence. If you could build one device using protected edge conduction, something you personally care about, what would you build, and why?